History tells us Ottoman women chose religious life out of devotion, but what if many of them never had a choice at all? Behind sacred walls, silence was enforced, freedom disappeared, and suffering was called holiness. So the question is, was religious life a sanctuary for Ottoman women, or a prison disguised as faith? To understand the religious life of Ottoman women, we first need to understand the world they lived in. The Ottoman Empire was not just a political superpower. It was a deeply religious civilization where faith shaped law, culture, family, and identity. Religion wasn't something you practiced privately. It defined who you were, how you lived, and most importantly, what was expected of you. For men, religion often meant authority. For women, it meant obedience. From a young age, Ottoman women were taught that virtue was measured by silence, modesty, and submission. A woman's honor was not her own. It belonged to her family, her community, and ultimately the religious order that governed her life. Religious teachings emphasized patience and sacrifice for women. Endurance was praised, questioning was discouraged, and suffering, especially silent suffering, was often framed as spiritual strength. But here's the contradiction. While religion promised dignity and protection, it also reinforced a system where women had very little control over their own lives. Their access to education was limited. Their movement was restricted. Their voices were rarely recorded. Elite women inside royal courts sometimes enjoyed influence and wealth, but even they lived behind walls, physically separated from public life. For ordinary women, the reality was far harsher. Poverty, rigid customs, and fear of dishonor shaped every major decision. Religion became the lens through which society justified these limits, not always out of faith, but out of control. And nowhere was this more visible than in the religious paths offered or imposed on women. For many Ottoman women, religious life was not a calling, it was a solution to a problem. A family without money, a girl without a marriage offer, a widow with no male protector, a daughter whose presence was seen as a burden. In these situations, religious institutions appeared as a respectable answer. Sending a girl into religious life preserved family honor. It reduced financial responsibility. And most importantly, it placed her under strict supervision, away from public scrutiny. But choice, as we understand it today, barely existed. Girls were often guided toward religious life before they fully understood what it meant. They were told it was noble, that it would bring blessings, that sacrifice would be rewarded in the afterlife. What they weren't told was what they would lose. Once inside, leaving was nearly impossible. Religious commitment was seen as permanent. A woman who attempted to return to society carried stigma, seen as impure, rebellious, or spiritually weak. Some women entered with genuine faith, hoping to find peace and purpose. Others entered out of fear of forced marriage, fear of abuse, fear of starvation. Ironically, the very system meant to protect women often stripped them of their autonomy. Inside religious life, obedience was not just expected, it was enforced. Questioning authority wasn't seen as curiosity, it was seen as defiance. And defiance, especially from women, was considered a moral failure. What awaited them behind those walls was not just prayer and devotion, but control, isolation, and silence. And as we move deeper into this world, we begin to see how daily life unfolded when faith became law and law became confinement. From the outside, religious spaces in the Ottoman world appeared calm, sacred, and orderly. But inside, daily life followed a rhythm that left little room for individuality or freedom. Each day began before sunrise. Women woke in silence, often to the sound of prayer or a bell-like call meant to signal obedience, not choice. Their schedules were rigid. Every hour was accounted for. Prayer, labor, study, and rest, all tightly controlled. There was no concept of personal time. Work was a constant presence. Women cooked, cleaned, sewed, copied texts, and performed unpaid labor that kept religious institutions running. This work was framed as devotion. Fatigue was praised as sacrifice. Complaints were treated as weakness of faith. Living conditions were modest at best and harsh at worst. Rooms were small, cold in winter, suffocating in summer. Privacy barely existed. Women slept, worked, and prayed under watchful eyes, constantly reminded that discipline was a spiritual duty. Silence was enforced, not encouraged. Speaking without permission, laughing too loudly, or expressing sadness could be interpreted as a lack of humility. Emotional expression was regulated just as strictly as physical movement. Even grief had rules. Contact with the outside world was limited or completely forbidden. Letters were monitored. Visits were rare. Many women lost touch with their families entirely, slowly becoming invisible to the world beyond the walls. Punishments were subtle but effective. Isolation, extra labor, public humiliation disguised as spiritual correction. These methods ensured obedience without leaving marks, making suffering easy to deny and impossible to prove. Over time, many women stopped resisting, not because they accepted their fate, but because resistance cost too much. Faith was no longer just belief, it became survival. In Ottoman religious life, control did not rely solely on walls or rules. It relied on something far more powerful, the control of the female body and voice. Modesty was presented as a sacred obligation, but in practice it functioned as surveillance. Every movement, gesture, and expression was judged through a moral lens. A woman's body was treated as a potential source of sin, not because of her actions, but because of her existence. Women were taught to lower their gaze, limit their speech, and suppress their presence. The ideal woman was barely noticed. Education, when offered, was selective. Women learned enough religion to obey, but rarely enough to interpret, question, or lead. Religious knowledge remained controlled by male authority, ensuring women depended on others to define morality for them. Questioning teachings was dangerous. A woman who asked why risked being labeled arrogant or spiritually corrupted. Doubt was not seen as part of faith, it was seen as rebellion, and rebellion carried consequences. Even personal suffering was reframed as divine testing. If a woman struggled, she was told to pray harder. If she felt trapped, she was reminded that patience guaranteed heavenly reward. This psychological control was devastating. By convincing women that obedience equaled holiness, the system removed the need for force. Many women began to police themselves, silencing their own thoughts, burying their own pain, fearing their own doubts. Their bodies belonged to the institution. Their voices belonged to God, as interpreted by men. And in this environment, the line between spiritual devotion and emotional imprisonment slowly disappeared.
This is where the story becomes complicated. Not every woman experienced religious life the same way. Some truly believed. They found comfort in prayer, purpose in routine, meaning in sacrifice. For them, faith offered a sense of identity in a world that denied women many roles. But even genuine devotion existed within a system that limited choice. Other women lived in constant internal conflict, believing in God, yet questioning the structure that claimed to represent him. They prayed sincerely while feeling trapped. They followed rules while quietly grieving the life they never had. This contradiction created deep emotional wounds. Leaving religious life was almost unthinkable. A woman who tried to leave risked social exile. She might never marry. She could be rejected by her family. In some cases, she had nowhere to go at all. So many stayed, not out of faith, but fear. Religion became a shield for society's expectations. It justified confinement, disguised inequality, and transformed control into virtue. And because it was labeled sacred, it became untouchable, immune to criticism. History often celebrates Ottoman religious life as disciplined and pious, but it rarely asks a crucial question. How many women were holy, and how many were simply trapped? As we continue, we will confront the stories history tried to forget, stories of suffering, abuse, and the women who paid the price for silence. Behind the language of holiness and devotion, there existed a reality few dared to name. Religious institutions were built on hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy were men. Male scholars, caretakers, and administrators held absolute authority over women's lives. And where power existed without accountability, abuse quietly followed. Most abuse was never written down. It didn't need to be. Neglect was common. Women who fell ill were often told their suffering was a spiritual test. Medical care was minimal. Emotional pain was dismissed as weakness. Loneliness was considered a failure of faith. More disturbing were the abuses that hid behind respect. Some women were subjected to emotional manipulation, constantly reminded of hell, shame, and divine punishment if they disobeyed. Fear became a tool. Guilt became a weapon. Physical abuse, when it occurred, was rarely acknowledged. Discipline was framed as correction. Punishment was justified as spiritual guidance. And because women were taught silence, most endured in isolation. There was no system for reporting abuse, no authority to appeal to, no safe place to speak. If a woman complained, she risked being labeled immoral or unstable. Her words carried little weight against male religious authority. In many cases, silence was safer than truth. So suffering stayed hidden. It lived in whispered prayers, in sleepless nights, in women who slowly disappeared from memory while still very much alive. And because history favors institutions over individuals, these stories were buried, leaving behind an image of purity that concealed deep human pain. Despite the walls, the rules, and the fear, not every woman remained silent. Defiance in the Ottoman religious world did not always look like rebellion. There were no armies, no public protests, no written manifestos. Resistance was quiet, often invisible, but it existed. Some women resisted through knowledge. They memorized religious texts, not just to obey, but to understand. In private moments, they questioned interpretations, shared ideas in whispers, and passed down alternative understandings of faith from woman to woman. This was dangerous. Knowledge gave women independence, and independence threatened authority. Others resisted through refusal, refusing to report fellow women, refusing to fully internalize shame, refusing to believe that suffering was the will of God. These small acts of defiance were rarely noticed, but they preserved something powerful: selfhood. A few women attempted escape. These stories are rare, not because they didn't happen, but because they were erased. Leaving religious life meant social death.
A woman who escaped risked poverty, violence, or complete isolation. Many were forced to change identities or disappear into distant communities. Many paid the ultimate price. Women who openly challenged authority were often punished, isolated, or removed from records entirely. Their names vanished. Their stories survived only as warnings, used to discourage others from questioning the system. Yet, even in silence, their courage mattered, because every act of resistance proved one thing: the system was not natural. It had to be enforced. These women remind us that obedience was never universal, and faith was never the same for everyone. Beneath centuries of silence, there were women who thought, doubted, resisted, and hoped for something more. They may not have monuments, they may not appear in history books, but their defiance cracks the illusion of a perfect past and forces us to see Ottoman religious life as it truly was: complex, human, and deeply flawed. And in remembering them, we restore what history tried to erase, not just their suffering, but their strength. History is written by those who hold power, and in the Ottoman world, women rarely held the pen. Official records focused on rulers, wars, laws, and religious achievements. Women appeared only in fragments, mentioned as daughters, wives, or symbols of morality. Their inner lives, struggles, and suffering were largely ignored. Religious life was often portrayed as honorable and peaceful. Any hardship was softened, any cruelty was omitted. Silence became historical convenience. Why? Because acknowledging women's suffering would challenge the image of a perfect moral system. It would force society to admit that religion, when controlled by power, can be used to oppress rather than protect. So pain was erased. Stories survived only through oral tradition, whispers passed from mother to daughter. Many were lost entirely, buried under centuries of praise and nostalgia. Even today, discussions about Ottoman religious life often avoid women's perspectives. The narrative remains incomplete, not because the truth doesn't exist, but because it is uncomfortable. But history that avoids discomfort is not truth, it is propaganda. By restoring these missing voices, we don't attack faith, we honor humanity, and we finally give space to the women who lived, suffered, believed, doubted, and endured in silence.
The Ottoman Empire may be gone, but its echoes are not. Many of the ideas shaped during that time still influence how religion and women's roles are discussed today. Traditions formed centuries ago continue to shape expectations, often without question. The belief that obedience equals virtue, that silence equals dignity, that suffering brings spiritual reward. These ideas didn't disappear with history, they evolved. In some communities, religion is still used to justify control over women's bodies, voices, and choices. Cultural practices are defended as sacred, even when they cause harm, and questioning them is often seen as betrayal rather than reflection. This is why understanding the past matters. When we ignore the lived experiences of Ottoman women, we risk repeating the same patterns, romanticizing tradition while overlooking human cost. History is not just about what happened, it's about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. By examining the dark truths of religious life for Ottoman women, we gain insight into how power, belief, and gender continue to intersect today. And perhaps we begin to ask better questions. At the beginning of this story, we asked a simple but unsettling question. Was religious life in the Ottoman world a sanctuary for women, or a prison disguised as faith? After walking through their lives, the answer is no longer simple.
For some women, faith was real. Prayer brought comfort. Devotion gave meaning in a world that offered few choices. But for countless others, religious life was shaped not by belief, but by control, fear, and silence. Their suffering was not accidental. It was built into a system that valued obedience over humanity, reputation over well-being, and tradition over truth. These women were told their pain was holy, that silence was strength, that endurance was virtue. And because their voices were never written into history, the world learned to admire the system without ever seeing its cost. But today, we can no longer look away. Remembering these women does not weaken faith, it strengthens honesty. It reminds us that religion, like any powerful force, can be used to uplift or to imprison, depending on who holds authority. The unnamed women of the Ottoman world prayed, suffered, believed, and doubted in silence. They lived entire lives behind walls, physical and invisible, never knowing their stories would one day be told. And now the responsibility is ours. To question what history praises without reflection, to listen to voices once erased, and to ask ourselves one final question. How many truths are still hidden simply because they make us uncomfortable to hear? Because history does not end in the past. It lives in what we choose to remember and what we finally choose to confront.